As Nintendo fans, we all have to acknowledge that the foundation of the entire company is built upon the success of the Donkey Kong IP. Although it is true that they produced video games before this, Donkey Kong was their big breakout hit. It introduced a unique concept, fun and memorable characters, and established a template for what would one day become Super Mario Bros. The biggest name in gaming, in other words. But as the brand has grown and changed over the years, it has become increasingly apparent that this game it is odds with the modern brand. Mario was originally intended to be the bad guy, after all. And why are they on a construction site anyway? As fans, it is our duty and obligation to figure out the mystery of just how, in universe, things became the way they are. Donkey Kong Bonanza has made numerous additions to the lore, and we now need to re examine the relationship between classic and modern DK. And I think I very may well have cracked the case. It's time to sit forward and obsess over what I'm about to tell you, because it is going to blow your mind. And to do that, we are going to have to start at the very beginning. Wait, no, this is too far back. Okay, that's more like it. So this is the beginnings of Donkey Kong. Mario rescues Pauline from Donkey Kong. At the time, Mario was called Junkman and they were in New York, but a lot of the core elements of what we know from the series is still present today. In fact, a lot of this iconography is still present in Donkey Kong Bonanza. And I do think that's an important thing to take note of when talking about this is that this 100% does take place in the same continuity, because it was established that Donkey Kong Country was a follow-up to the original arcade Donkey Kong, and this has references to Donkey Kong Country. You know, specifically a lot of the characters and a lot of the events were referenced. It is very important to emphasize this going into this there is a very clear natural progression when it comes to Donkey Kong lore. So we've established that the original arcade game is still canon, that it's still relevant, that it's still influencing modern Nintendo and modern Mario games and Donkey Kong games. So what exactly does that mean? What exactly happens in Donkey Kong the arcade game? In this game, Jumpman scales the construction building, he rescues Pauline, he defeats Donkey Kong, and then they have a romantic moment together. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of specifics about what this is all about and what this all means. I've seen a lot of fans try and argue that because Donkey Kong in this game is actually Cranky Kong from Donkey Kong Country, there is reason to suspect that Jumpman and Pauline in this game are actually different characters from the Mario and Pauline we know today. You know, Pauline specifically makes a lot of references to her grandmother in Bonanza, which seems to imply that there may be some connection between her and the arcade game, that she's a descendant of the classic Pauline and not literally the same character. But I think we can safely dismiss that, considering that we've already seen Pauline in Mario Odyssey and kind of established some of the things about the lore. Specifically the fact that, yes, this was the same Pauline that was kidnapped by a giant ape. A lot of people have tried to argue that, oh, well, the ape she was referring to was Void Kong, and yet Void isn't that big, bro. Like, he isn't giant by any stretch of the imagination. So, again, so that entire coat falls apart. Like, this is the Mario Odyssey Pauline is established at being the same character as arcade Pauline. So if you were to argue that Pauline in Bonanza is the granddaughter of this character, you would, by extension, be arguing that she is the granddaughter of the Pauline in Odyssey, which just raises a whole lot of weird questions that really don't make a whole lot of sense. For example, Why does New Donk City feature a lot of Donkey Kong memorabilia? Like, why does it have streets named after Donkey Kong characters? Why is it called New Donk City when it's pretty apparent by playing Bananza that the city is on the opposite side of the world from Kong Island? You can actually see this in the map screen in Bananza if you look at the menus. Like when you go out through the Bandandium route near the end, like you can see that you go out through the opposite side of where you came in. So in other words, like New Donk City is on the other side of the world to where Donkey Kong came from, which just makes the fact that the culture is so rooted in Donkey Kong stuff just seem really bizarre, especially when you take into consideration that if this does take place later on in the timeline, after the original arcade game, then that means Donkey Kong kidnapped a little girl and took her up a building. Again, maybe that's in character for New Donkers because they literally named a street after K. Rool, but this is the frustrating thing about Bananza. This is the thing that everyone noticed almost immediately and don't really seem to have a proper explanation for, is that it seems to take place both before and after the original arcade game. Pauline is young, but the events of the arcade game have obviously happened. Theoretically, this should take place before Odyssey, and yet New Donk City looks more modern than it did in Super Mario Odyssey. So what exactly is happening here? The correct answer, the real truth, is that this is both a prequel and a sequel. Let me explain. The answer, of all things, comes from the ending of Super Mario Galaxy, in which Mario saves the universe, it implodes upon itself, and then Rosalina appears to explain that in this setting, the natural life cycle of the universe is to die and be reborn. She compares it to the life cycle of the Lumas themselves, who are stars, and simply claims that the universe is itself is a larger scale version of that. But the implications of this statement are interesting because what happens in Super Mario Galaxy 2 is that Mario essentially goes through the plot of Super Mario Galaxy again with different characters with a similar setting, but it's very clearly not a direct sequel to Mario Galaxy. It almost feels like it takes place in a parallel reality, but it's not. What actually happened is that is one of the new universes that was spawned after a reset. So the reason Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not in sync with Super Mario Galaxy 1 is because it is a new galaxy. So this explains everything, right? So the Donkey Kong games, the Donkey Kong Country line, are direct sequels that take place in the same continuity, in the same timeline, which explains their reoccurring elements and their just how there's a clear progression in the plot. K. Rool appears, they fight him, he goes underground for a bit, and then they fight him again. And, there's a very clear progression in what happens from the Donkey Kong side of things. It doesn't get confusing until you bring the Mario side of things into it. When you realize all, the alternate takes on the character and all the sports games and all the weird stuff that happens and, the Mario settings and the timeline for that, it just makes no sense at all. Even sometimes in, the same series of games. Right? This is something we've talked about a lot, how Mario doesn't have a timeline at all. But this is the reason why for it. This explains why the setting is so radically different. Is that in the original Donkey Kong timeline, in that universe, Mario left New York, proceeded to the Mushroom Kingdom, saved Peach, and then dump Pauline so he could be with there and go on his endless adventure. That's what happened in the original timeline. But ever since then, Mario's gone through numerous universal resets and basically lives out his adventures indefinitely, forever. While Donkey Kong has gotten older and continued with his adventures. So Bananza the thing that sets apart Bonanza from the rest of the Donkey Kong lore is that this is a Donkey Kong game that takes place after Pauline is brought into the Universal Reset. Because the reason why we weren't seeing her earlier in other Mario games was because she wasn't part of it. She wasn't part of the endless loop that like Mario, Luigi, Peach, Daisy, and like the rest were in. So like eventually she came to the Mushroom Kingdom as well and joined in. And Bonanza is the first ever time that she was rebooted with the rest of the galaxy. So this is why she's younger now. This is why the lore doesn't make any sense with the established Donkey Kong continuity. This is why things are the way they are. It's because the galaxy is different every single time it's rebooted. So this is the real explanation as to why Bonanza makes absolutely no sense lore-wise. Is that like it is a completely new galaxy. And this is why going forward that Nintendo and Mario games will continue having these kind of weird deviations from established lore and continuity, is because these universal resets happen all the time. Not maybe in between every single game. I think we can safely agree that the Mario and Luigi series takes place in one single contained like timeline, but like it really does put things into perspective as to like why characters suddenly disappear, why there's this like a feeling of things like always being slightly different, how the castle doesn't look exactly the same, how it's not in the same location. Like it explains like everything about these games is that the universe is resetting itself all the time, and this is the end result of it, is that everything is slightly different.